الدكتور تيم اندرسون كاتب وباحث أسترالي ومحاضر في جامعة سيدني، وهب وقته ودراساته وأبحاثه من أجل أن يكشف حقيقة الحرب القذرة على سوريا كما سماها هو في كتابه. إنسان لا نقدر أن نختزله في كلمات، وفي كتابه هذا يلقي الضوء على بعض من حبه للإنسانية والوصول إلى الحد الأدنى من العدالة والإنصاف للشعب السوري والدولة السورية التي تعاني من إرهاب دولي لم تتعرض له دولة أخرى.
I didn't know very much about Syria before the conflict began, but I was very suspicious of the stories that were coming from the media, the Western media at that time. So I decided, and I'd seen other conflicts in Latin America, for example, where pretexts were used for interventions in other countries. And so I started to study how this conflict began, particularly in the conflict in Daraa. So I was studying how the conflict began, and I began to talk with Syrians in my country, Syrians that lived in my city too, and we formed a group called Hands Off Syria to defend Syria and to try and correct the misinformation that was being put out about Syria. This was in 2012. During that time we also began the idea of creating a delegation to come to Syria in solidarity with Syria under attack by foreign-backed terrorist groups. So finally at the end of 2013 I came to Syria with an Australian delegation. We met a number of ministers, we met the president, we travelled around a little bit and saw in particular Damascus and Latakia, and began to get to know Syria a little bit more. Since then, this is my 5th time in Syria, and I'm still studying Syrian culture, Syrian language, and I suppose, like any culture, it's you have to learn by reading, but it's also good to visit and read the people, to meet the people and get some greater depth of your understanding of another culture. So I'm still doing that. I still regard myself as a student of Syria. I'm still studying Syria. I've come to know that there's a lot of depth in Syrian culture and Syrian history, and they're the things that bring me back here to visit this country and to meet more people. Because I'm a writer and academic, I began to read and write some short articles, and I began to study the history of the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, the role of Saudi Arabia in backing Salafi groups in the region, in the entire region. And I wrote some little articles. Some of them were longer. The ones on the Muslim Brotherhood and the Saudis were longer, more a research article, and I presented that at a conference. I wanted to share it with my friends. And after a while the idea came to bring together some articles to prepare a book. And at first I was thinking of putting together some of the essays I'd written, and then I thought, no, this war has become so controversial that I should present it as a research work. And so then all the chapters of the book eventually were referenced research works, like an academic work, so that people could go back and check the sources and check the information about the origins of the war and the origins of the stories that were being told about Syria. So then I wrote that through 2015. The book was published in 2016, and there's been a lot of interest in the book, particularly in Europe. The book is now published in 8 languages, so there's been interest because a lot of the information that Western countries were getting in various languages was very distorted. It remains very distorted, and there wasn't a lot of material in English, at least, to present a side more in defence of the independence of Syria and against the intervention, basically, based on principles of international law. So that book came out in early 2016. So yes, the Western media still calls the war on Syria a civil war. Of course, there were some elements of that at the beginning, because the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood was central to the Free Army groups at the beginning, but immediately they were supported by international jihadists through Jabhat al-Nusra to start with. They came in from Lebanon to start with, from the north of Lebanon, and then later on from Turkey. So ever since the beginning there have been international terrorists coming to Syria, but they began to dominate in 2012, I believe, with the large numbers that came across from Turkey into Aleppo in particular. And then later on the Daesh group that came from Iraq, basically. So the conflict is orchestrated from outside, has always been an attack on Syria to try and overthrow the government in Syria, the independent government, as one of a series of attacks on independent states in this region. And it was Syria's turn in 2011 after they destroyed Libya. But of course the problem for the big powers was that Syria resisted for a very long time, largely with its own efforts. So the Syrian people made it very clear to the world that they're not going to become another Saudi Arabia. And yes, of course, they got help from their friends in Russia and Iran and Hezbollah, or from Lebanon, the resistance in Lebanon. But really the Syrian people, it was the unity of the Syrian people and their support for the army, the fact the army did not fracture, that basically has held Syria together in face of this largest scale terrorist attack on a country in living memory. So it's never really been a civil war. The war on Syria is really, for me, it's a propaganda war, an economic war, and the real war all together at the same time. The propaganda war is trying to demoralize Syrians. It's trying to turn other people in the world against Syria. The economic war is trying to weaken Syria's economy, weaken people's will to resist. And the physical war is that terrible terrorist war. And the economic war is being practiced across this region and across the world. I studied Cuba, for example, which has been under sanctions for 55 years. Recently I visited Iran. Iran has been under sanctions. Korea, independent Korea in the north, has been under sanctions. The US has about 25 countries directly under sanctions, and those sanctions also affect other countries. So the US has almost half the world under sanctions. Now the sanctions here in Syria are very severe. It makes it very difficult to transfer any funds here. We have to bring cash into this country. So they've made it extremely difficult for Syrians to survive. You know, earlier this year the World Health Organization said there was a big problem with critical medicines here because of these sanctions by the Europeans and the US. I think some of the Europeans are having second thoughts about that now, and we need to encourage those second thoughts. But economic war is an adjunct, a supplement to the terrorist war that's been carried out about this country. So I've been looking at, as a researcher, different strategies to resist that economic war and the relations between independent countries, for example, between Iran and Venezuela, between Cuba and Syria, for example. And I think there's a lot to learn from those strategies from different countries that have been resisting this economic war for many years. So every empire that has wanted to dominate people and dominate entire regions has always looked for weak points, how they can divide people. How can they divide people further? Because if people unite against these powers, they can resist properly. If they're very divided, they're weak, they can't resist. So in this case, of course, they've tried to use, in this entire region, they've tried to use religion and different communities to divide people. But Syria, of all the countries in the region, has had this very strong nationalist sense that has helped unite people, you know, despite the fact that, of course, there are very clear identities in Syria. People's historical, religious identities are there, but there's a strong national identity. And so the Syrian Arab Army, for example, is composed of all of the different groups in Syria. So it's been very difficult for the big powers to use religion, but they have used religion. They keep using religion to fool people, particularly to fool uneducated people. And it's really important that Syria has united in face of that attempt to divide people. Of course, this was done historically after the Ottoman Empire. The British and the French divided countries up. They carved out a section of Palestine. They didn't recognize Palestine. They divided Lebanon into a sectarian state. They reduced the size of Syria. And, you know, they created Kuwait. They made so many divisions. Indeed, In recent times they've talked about a second Sykes-Picot agreement, but that would be to divide people even further into ethnic groups and, for example, create a Kurdistan, which is like a second Israel. Israel is very happy with that because Israel really would like to see more sectarian states like itself and less unified, strong national states like Syria. But Syria has showed that it's, despite all the pain, it's been worth uniting and resisting these pressures. They only serve the big powers that try to destroy people and destroy their social structures, their social support. Syria is really the example in this region of resisting that pressure to divide people on community basis. President Bashar, I had seen a number of interviews with him before I came to Syria, and so you get quite a strong impression of his personality from seeing those interviews. And when I met him, he was the same person. There are not two Bashar al-Assads. There's one person, and he has the same personality when you meet him as when you see him in public. He's a cultured man, a sensitive man, a well-educated man. He's worried about the impact of the crisis of the war on his people. That's very clear. The one thing that he said when our delegation met him was he was concerned about the psychological impact on children of this crisis because of the atrocities that children have said and the way in which this has been linked to religious ideas, people saying Allahu Akbar when they're killing someone or cutting someone's throat, for example. He was concerned about the damage on children. Well, it's just quite consistent with what you see him acting in everyday way and the way he's been shown. In the Western media, of course, I think we have to recognise it's a great achievement that they've turned this quite sensitive, well-educated man into a monster. That, you know, this is the new Hitler. How could they do this? There's nothing about his behaviour, about his attitude. He doesn't talk like George W. Bush. He doesn't talk like Saddam Hussein even. He's his own person. The criticism I heard more often when I came to Syria was that they were concerned that their president was too soft. They called him Mr. Soft-Heart, and they were worried that he wasn't firm enough in the crisis. Well, whatever the truth of that, I think that he has become more decisive. He's been forced to become more decisive and a stronger leader through this crisis. And I think that's more in fitting with what the Syrian people wanted. It's very clear that he's retained his popularity through the crisis. There have been a number of polls done before and after the crisis on his popularity. He has remained a very popular figure, and that's from independent evidence, not just from the Syrian elections and the Syrian polls. So the idea that this was a man killing his own people has always been absurd. It's an absurd lie that was created to try and perpetuate this war. By the way, they said the same things about Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, and after they destroyed Libya and murdered President Gaddafi, most of those same people have admitted that those were lies that were told about Gaddafi killing his own people too. They admitted that they were lies were told about even Saddam Hussein, who was a cruel man, but the lies about weapons of mass destruction, they admitted those lies. Those sort of lies no longer matter when that war is over. But in the case of Syria, the war has gone on for quite a long time. The Syrian Arab Army, Jaish al-Arabi al-Suri, it's become famous in the world now. Famous because they said it would collapse within weeks or months. They said that it was not fighting Daesh, and then it took over Palmyra. The media in my country, which was very against Syria, they were shocked when the Syrian army took over Palmyra, with support from their friends in the resistance in Lebanon, with support from their friends in Iran and from Russia. The Western media has told about Syria for the last 6.5 years.
في كتابه الحرب القذرة على سوريا يوضح الكاتب حقيقة الأمور منذ اندلاع شرارة الحرب الكونية على سوريا، مذكراً بفكرة الشرق الأوسط الجديد التي طرحت منذ سنوات قبل بدء ما سمي بالربيع العربي. ويبدأ بسرد منطقي وموضوعي للأحداث وكيف تعامل معها الإعلام الغربي بطريقة ممنهجة ومقصودة وبتوجيه من الدول الداعمة للجماعات الإرهابية من أجل تدمير الدولة السورية بحجة الحرية والديمقراطية المزعومة.
In my book, The Dirty War on Syria, I spent a whole chapter on the e-scooter incident in August 2013 to investigate very thoroughly all the evidence about that incident. And it was very clear that the attack had not come from the side of the Syrian Arab Army. Clear from independent evidence, not from what the Syrian government was saying, not from what the jihadists were saying. There was independent evidence to show that this had not come from the Syrian army. Syria historically had chemical weapons as a deterrent to Israel, nuclear-armed Israel. And the use of those weapons would only be effective in the case of a large-scale invasion, to use chemical weapons against a very large invading army. This has never been the case. None of the incidents in Syria have been involved large-scale chemical attacks. They are small attacks carried out by the jihadists themselves to try and create a provocation, to try and create a pretext for greater Western intervention. That's been the case from beginning to end. There has not been one credible allegation of chemical weapons used by the Syrian army in the entire conflict since 2011. And I'm talking about independent evidence. There is this UN commission that's been set up which recently made some claims. This is led by a US diplomat. They take no information from the Syrian government. They pay no regard to the independent evidence, for example, from the forensic expert who works for the Pentagon, Professor Ted Postol, who showed that the e-scooter attack was a fake. He showed that the Khan Sheikhoun attack was a fake. That committee also acknowledged, or a member of that committee, Khaled El Ponte, acknowledged in 2013 that it was Jabhat al-Nusra that first used sarin in Syria, in Khan al-Assal in Aleppo in early 2013. So there's never been credible evidence the Syrian army has used chemical weapons. There's no reason, there's no motive for them to do it. They're destroying these groups with much superior weapons, far superior weapons to those sorts of crude weapons. To the Syrian people, I know virtually every family has lost dear ones. I can't imagine the pain that so many families have gone through. I have met a number of families who've lost their brothers and their fathers and their sisters and their children. But I just want you to know that you have resisted and you are winning. You're winning now, and you do have friends around the world. People around the world have observed your resistance. It's an incredible resistance, and it's going to change the nature of this entire region, not just Syria, but the entire region. I know Lebanon is changing already because of the resistance in Syria. Iraq is changing. So just to say, you do have friends, and we will help you where we can. To the Western governments, I would say, just get out of Syria. Get out of this region. You have done no good. You've joined yourself with an operation to try and dominate this region, to try and destroy the independent states. Whatever pretexts have been put up for the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan and the interventions in Libya and Lebanon and Syria, they were all fake pretexts. Just get out and you will be able to construct some respectful relationships with the people of this region. There is no productive role for the US or its hangers-on in this region. The peoples of the Middle East and the peoples of Syria want to rebuild their own societies without your intervention. If you want to understand something about friendship, start to think about that, getting out and developing some respectful relationships. Thank you.